Today we're excited to have Tanner Corbridge and Jared Jones, Partners in Leadership's hospital practice leaders, and two of our business unit presidents hosting today's webinar. They have extensive experience working directly with senior leaders and leading significant projects at some of the largest for-profit, nonprofit, and faith-based hospitals in America. They have helped them achieve dramatic shifts in HCAP scores, staff and physician engagement levels, and other core measures. So, Tanner and Jared, let's get started.
Thanks, Jesse. So, guys, we're excited to be on with you guys today. We have worked with hospitals. I mean, every week we're in hospitals virtually. And today is really an opportunity for us to share with you some of the things that we've learned and are continuing to learn in relation specifically to improving HCAP scores and satisfaction levels. So as we jump into this, Partners in Leadership's been around for about 25 years. And actually, I'm not seeing my slides advance here, Jesse. Let's see. Does that work? There we go. And we work with organizations on 3 tracks. Those 3 tracks are broken down around some of our content that we've created. And so we're going to spend just a minute here on this to give you a brief introduction into Partners in Leadership. The self-track is what we call, it's based on the best-selling book, The Oz Principle, and it's really on how do you get individual accountability. When you're talking about a hospital environment, you know, accountability, it's getting people to engage at the right level. And so the steps to accountability that we're going to get into later is the core model with that book. The culture track is how do you actually get into the team dynamics and team dynamics of accountability and create a real focus and alignment around the results that we're trying to achieve within our organization. The others track is specifically around how do you hold people accountable in a positive and principled way. And in the hospital environment, it's not the punitive approach to that, but more of a positive, principled way of holding others accountable. It's getting in front of problems, not waiting for problems to come up. We're going to spend most of our time today as it relates to the culture track and some of the self-track to get right at HCAPs. So, Tanner, why don't you speak to this piece on strategy and culture for a moment?
Yeah, I'll just make one point on the self-culture and others tracks. This won't surprise you, but the vast majority of individuals that are interested in addressing the topic of organizational culture, organizational accountability, when you consider these 3 tracks, you know, if I were to ask you the question, where do most people want to start this conversation? The vast majority of us would say, clearly it's the others track. You know, physicians are calling saying, the nursing staff's broken, can you fix that? The nursing staff's calling saying the physicians are broken, can you fix them? And so we do have a tendency to externalize the need for change. And we tend to be very concerned about others being accountable when in fact we've got to address the individual side of it first. And we've got to acknowledge that we need a culture that will support us holding other people accountable in a positive, principled way. So when the topic of HCAP's performance surfaces, we always like to pose the question, where do we tend to go first when we want to fix the patient experience? Do we tend to default to strategy or do we default to culture? And so we're actually going to get your input on this. So, Jesse, why don't we go live with our poll here, and we're just going to pose the question to you, 2 questions. The first question is, when working to improve HCAP scores, where do we spend most of our time today? Do we spend time on strategy and do we push the strategy button, or do we default to culture and push the culture button? Question 2, what has the most impact on our HCAP scores? Option A, strategy. Option B, culture. So we're going to give you 30 seconds or so to respond to those 2 questions. If you happen to be seated in a larger group or in a conference room, as we know some on this call are, we'd ask you to just come to a quick consensus with your group on both questions. Question 1, when working with HCAP scores, where do we tend today to spend most of our time within our hospital or within our system? Strategy or culture? And question 2, which has the most impact on our HCAP scores today?
So just look to the right in your screen there. You'll see those 2 poll questions with the options. Go ahead, select the options, and then hit submit. And then we'll close out that poll in just a moment and bring up the results so that all of you can see exactly how the call responds to that. Now, just by way of a little bit of discussion of who's on the call, we've got a number of different hospitals represented on the call today, and everything from CEOs of those organizations, CNOs, to nurse directors, to lab directors. We've got a whole variety of people on the call from different hospitals. So you're going to get a good mix here on these responses. It's also good to acknowledge that when you start looking at culture, you know, we hold up certain organizations that have done really well with HCAPs, like Cleveland Clinic, for example, or others. And if you ask yourself the question, what has really enabled those organizations to reach the levels that they've reached with satisfaction, you could look at these 2 things, strategy and culture, and probably acknowledge that they're doing both really well. What we've noticed when it comes to HCAPs right now is we tend to get into let's copy what's made others successful, and let's go do that, and that gets to that strategy piece. But what we find is we don't actually address the underlying foundation that's helped make those organizations so successful, which is culture. So let's see how everyone responds to this.
So let's go ahead, Jesse, let's close the poll, and we'll give you a moment to show us the results. To Jared's point, when we've looked at this, and we've looked at it for a long time, we've been in and out of hospitals for many, many years. We spend most of our time week in and week out looking at a balanced approach to the patient experience. So most organizations tend to be highly imbalanced in their approach. They tend to be greatly focused on strategy, and they tend to spend very little time pushing the culture button or acknowledging the reality that culture is having a major impact on the patient experience. So as you look at the responses, and we could have told you the responses would look like this before we even put the questions up, and you knew what this was going to look like too before we put it up.
Always looked at it.
81% of us are saying today, when working on HCAP scores, we go to strategy. 19% say culture. Question 2 tends to be, the 96-4 tends to be very common in response to this question. What has a greater impact on HCAP scores today, strategy and culture? And that's the great irony. That's the great paradox. The great paradox is we're putting tremendous amount of energy and focus on the strategy side, and we're ignoring the reality that what the patient is really feeling and what the patient is most concerned about is the experience. So if you move kind of to the basic premise of the next 45 minutes or so that we'll be together, very simple. Point 1, every hospital employee creates the culture. There's not a single person within the hospital that's not contributing to the current culture. Point 2, the hospital culture will determine the outcomes. We don't spend time on culture because it's warm and fuzzy. We don't spend time on it because it makes for a fun place to work. You know, we don't do it because it leads to engagement. There's one reason we work on culture. Culture ultimately produces the end results that we're most interested in.
And to that point, Tanner, the reason why we see a lot of organizations have this imbalance is they don't know how to work on culture. They don't even know how to define culture in a way that's actionable, that's manageable. So as we get into this today, we're going to actually define culture for you in a way that's very formulaic. It's not about the ice cream parties that we throw to make the culture feel good. That's not culture work in our minds. We're going to be very formulaic to what Tanner just described and how you actually design culture to produce outcomes.
So a culture of accountability by definition produces the best results. We'll give more context around what we mean by culture of accountability as we progress here. And then finally, the final point of the premise is simply that it's not just about change, it's about how do you do it quickly. There's not a hospital in America today who's not posing the question, how do we continue to accelerate our ability to deliver on the patient experience? Maybe there are a few, but there are very, very few exceptions to that reality. And so how do you not just position change and the notion for change, but how do you accelerate it? How do you make it happen quickly?
So this model is called the results pyramid, and this model gives you a great framework for understanding what culture means, how it works, and actually how it determines the scores you're getting on HCAPs and other outcomes in your hospitals. The results, at the top of the pyramid, you've got results. Below that, you've got actions. Below actions, you've got beliefs. And at the very bottom of the pyramid are experiences. What this really is just saying is everyone every day is having experiences that are leading you to think a certain way. Those are your beliefs. Those beliefs determine the actions you take, and those actions get the results. A really simple example of this is we were working with an emergency department. And when we spoke with the director of the department, we asked her, how are your results? Well, she said, there's one result specifically that we're not getting the results we want, and it's getting emergency contact information, next of kin information. When people get admitted, we're only getting it 42% of the time. That means roughly 60% of the time we don't know who to call when there's a problem. So we asked her, so what are you doing about it? She goes, well, I put together a new form. Our forms were complicated. There was too many. I got it down to 1 page. Then I had that form translated into 6 different languages. Then I actually put a training together and put 120 people through the training on how to use the form and readmit people properly. It took her 4.5 months to do that. So look at the pyramid. What layer of the pyramid has she been working on up to this point to try to improve getting emergency contact information? Well, we would say it's right at the action layer. That her pyramid is only 2 layers deep. She's working the top 2 layers the whole time. New form, new training, all that stuff. Now, we're going to ask you guys on this call the same question we asked her as she was describing this to us. If they're only getting the information 42% of the time, what's her belief or what's their belief about that information? Well, you might say that it's not important, right? We know that when we ask for that question, typically people say, well, they don't think the information was important, so they're not getting it. Well, that's absolutely right. So when you step back and look at what do you have to do to change a belief, the model would suggest you have to create a new experience. Have you ever had someone tell you, I'm going to be different from now on? How does that work for you? You're actually waiting for someone to do something different. So in this case, she said, well, I'm not going to hurt people in the emergency department to make the point. We said, that's right. So you're left with the next best option, which is referential experiences, or simply called stories. So she found 2 stories in her department that she knew would change this approach or this perspective on getting next of kin, and she told them for 3 weeks straight. And the stories are really simple. The first story was there was a college student who got hit by a car. She got brought into the emergency department. While they were treating her, she became unconscious, unresponsive. They tried a number of things to get her back. Nothing worked. They lost her. She died. They found out later she had a medical condition they were completely unaware of. Had they been aware of it, it would have dramatically altered their treatment for her and thus helping improve her chances of survival. Now, same hospital, different story. An older man was brought in with chest pain. They were treating him. He became unconscious. They called his daughter, whose information they had gathered from him. They said, here's the medical history we have for your father. Is there anything on this list that you know about that we don't, that's missing? She said, yeah, he had a procedure 3 weeks ago. It's not on your list. Is he taking any medication for that procedure? She said, yes, he's got a prescription. Do you know what the prescription is? She said, well, no, but I know he's got it, and he's taking something. I took him to the pharmacy. He went in. He came out with something. They were able to ascertain what the standard prescriptions would be for the procedure he had. Then looking at what they were giving him and the symptoms he was displaying, they quickly were able to triangulate this and realize that what they were giving him was conflicting with what he was taking. They fixed it. They got this guy back, saved his life. She told those 2 stories for the next 3 weeks. She had her staff telling them. They went on a campaign to make sure everyone heard them for the next 3 weeks. At the end of that 3 weeks, she got the report. They'd gone from getting next of kin information 47% of the time to getting it 92% of the time in 3 weeks. So what happened? The belief changed. The belief became next of kin information impacts patient safety. So group, this is just one simple example to highlight this model. And we're going to dig into this model and take it right to HCAPS here in a minute and show you different ways to look at this. But the core of that story is showing, and there's lots of different stories that Tanner and I could share here, the core of that story is showing that people don't just show up different because they were told to show up different. You've got to get them to think different so that they act different, which will produce the results that you're getting right now. Tanner, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I'd add a couple of things, and we've given you an example of how this model works. Let me kind of explain the model in its practical context. Belief bias is the tendency that people have to validate their perception as to the way we do things around here. And Jared just described, by virtue of that story, belief bias. And belief bias is constantly at work. It is all day long informing our people how to think and act relative to the patient experience. And it never sleeps. And the reality of belief bias working and informing behavior is so significant, it's so substantial, that if we're talking about change management, excuse me, we don't address the reality that people hold beliefs, and those beliefs are rooted in very real experience, they won't let go of those beliefs easily. And so the top two levels of this model we refer to the top two levels of this model as the leadership trap. When leaders aren't getting the results they want to deliver, the question becomes, which two levels of this model do they tend to work? Do they tend to work the top two levels of the model or the bottom two levels? And without fail, the answer to that question uniformly, unanimously, is we work the top two levels of the pyramid. We're concerned about HCAPs, and when we're not getting the result we want to on patient experience, we go right to actions. We create new checklists, we create new policy, we hammer out new procedure, we create new SOPs, and then we create new action plans. And 4 months later, when those action plans haven't moved the needle on HCAPs, we're creating new action plans. Or they move the needle for a 4-week cycle, next report comes out and we're disappointed, we wonder what happened. Well, almost without fail, that effort was centered at the top two levels of the results pyramid. We're ignoring the fact that people hold beliefs, and those beliefs always win. They always dictate the way that people act. So when Jared gives the example earlier of the Cleveland Clinic, or any other system out there that's held up as the standard for patient experience, you'll always see culture at the root of it. The industry today is trying to sell a silver bullet, if you will, around this fix. We say, okay, the way to do this is you checklist your way to the patient experience. Well, that's top two layers. That's a tell them, bribe them, force them approach to management. Hold people compliant to specific actions, and hope those actions get you to a result.
And they're research and evidence-based. We get that. There's things that they are doing consistently, but how do they come up with those things?
And rounding has to occur, and leader rounding has to occur. Those are all very positive things. And on the hour, those are all very good principles. But you can do everything on the checklist and still miss the patient experience.
Totally. So when you step back and think about what really drove all that to begin with, it was a set of beliefs. There were a set of beliefs at the core of all of those findings that drove the research to come up with, these are the things that work. But have you ever seen the exact same list of activities or action layer things be put into one organization and have them work totally differently than they did in another organization? Well, the answer to that question, I know with all of you unanimously, yes, because you've got a set of beliefs in each of your hospitals that's currently working. It's working for you, working against you actually, but it's working today in some way, shape, or form to produce actions. And those actions are getting the results you're getting right now. So when you step back and look at trying to improve this, if we try to action plan or policy or checklist our way to something without addressing what's going on at the bottom two layers of the pyramid, you end up in what Tanner just described as being completely frustrated, and that you're putting tons of energy and effort into something and you're not seeing the results you want.
So one way to kind of sum up this thought here is that you cannot action plan your way to being caring and compassionate, to being human with patients. We've done a ton of both leader rounding and patient rounding in our careers. And what happens, it's an amazing phenomenon that happens. We deliver on the checklist, but we miss the human element of creating an experience that fosters the belief we need that patient holding about their experience. Now, we're generalizing here.
It feels robotic, right?
That's right, yeah. If we're doing the checklist, and anytime you generalize, there's a danger in that. But the reality is the patient is sensing the experience. And if the experience is not one that would be entirely centered on what really HCAPs are centered on, and that is care and compassion and the humanism of the patient experience, then we can do everything that's right on the checklist, execute every action plan perfectly, and still miss the patient experience.
I mean, even the environmental questions or pain management, those things all come down to, do we really care enough or understand enough about what's most important to this patient to make them feel satisfied? So where would you put culture on this model? If you looked at this model and you asked yourself, where does culture fit? We get all kinds of answers to that question. The reality is culture is the bottom 3 layers of this pyramid. When we ask people, describe your culture, what they start describing to us is we think this way, we act this way, we do this, we think like this. That's where culture really shows up.
Final thought I'd offer on this. A management-centric approach to getting better results is to work the top 2 levels of this model. And it's to, again, hold people compliant to the behavior we need to see from them and put pressure on it. And as soon as we stop putting pressure at the action layer and we go manage to compliance on some other issue, what happens? Well, it shows up again. The old behavior shows up again. We look at it and we go, well, why is that happening? The reason is we never addressed the belief. We never acknowledged the reality of what was really going on, and that people, again, will always default back to the belief they hold. So managers work the top 2 levels of the model. Leaders are most concerned about the beliefs their people hold. They know if they can get the belief right, people are going to self-select hundreds of different behaviors that would be in line with the culture, in line with the belief. And so we waste a lot of time managing at the action layer, at the activity behavior layer. And it's actually a lot more fun to lead at the bottom 2 levels of the pyramid because people look around at what needs to be done and they act. That's essentially the power of organizational culture.
So let's talk about how culture impacts this from an HCAP score standpoint. Even at the patient level, if you look at the patient experience, do patients walk in your doors at your hospitals with beliefs already in place? Absolutely. And when they come in with those beliefs, they're actually looking, this is where belief bias sets in. They're looking to validate the belief they already hold. Maybe they heard a story about your hospital. Maybe they had an experience previously at a totally different hospital, and they're bringing that belief now to your hospital. We're action planning our way to these solutions by trying to create all these different checklists, but the reality is we have no idea in most cases what that patient actually thinks or what they're concerned about or worried about. So when you step in here, one of the biggest variables in the patient experience is the patient belief, but we're not addressing that very well. And as we look at the organizations that we're working with, one of the things that we're trying to help uncover is make sure that you're able to address what the patient belief is first, because whatever that patient belief is what they're going to be looking for, and it's going to drive their actions, and it's going to drive how they actually answer the survey.
So if I could give one example of that, we were recently involved in doing some shadow leader rounding, and the leader walked in, and we saw this how many times during the day? 7, 8 different times where the exact same thing happened. Leader walks in, does the leader round, and asks, how are you feeling about your nurse? And rock star nurse, I love my nurse, couldn't be better. I want to create a statue over at my home, and I feel great about my nurse. And then the leader moves into the leader rounding questions, and suddenly the response is, well, no, I'm not seeing that every hour from my nurse, or no, I'm not seeing that level from EVS.
My plan of care isn't on the whiteboard.
My plan of care, yeah, my plan of care is not on the whiteboard. And suddenly there's 2 things happening here. There's an us versus them experience created by the leader.
The nurse is feeling checked on.
That's right. It's kind of big brother coming in. And number 2, we're now anchoring belief bias in a different direction. We're helping the patient see all sorts of experiences that aren't happening.
And it feels like they should be happening. So the patient now is saying, well, maybe my nurse sucks. Maybe she's not as good as she should be.
And so if the number of hospitals we're working with, you'll hear this common theme of we instituted this action layer heavy approach to leader rounding, and our scores tipped. Well, there's a reason for that. It's rooted in the experience that's happening. It's fostering perhaps beliefs that we don't want the patient to
And again, it's not that the questions or that the leader rounding is the problem. It's the culture that we've got that's underpinning it. If we have people doing it without the proper thinking, then the action layer just isn't sufficient. So when you start looking at this from a standpoint of culture, let's talk about this model helps us see how the culture really comes alive and becomes more formulaic for you. Your current results that you're getting right now, let's just take your HCAP scores. those are what they are because people are thinking and acting a certain way in your culture. They have certain experiences happening today, certain beliefs happening today, and they have certain actions that they're taking today.
And we call that R1. The results you're getting today, for example, on HCAPS, is R1.
Right. So R1 is what you're getting right now. But you all have a problem. The problem is you need R2. So can you stick R2 on top of C1 and expect that to work? Well, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, right? It's not going to happen. What's required is actually a shift from C1 to C2. In other words, how do we need people to think and act if we're going to achieve R2? That shift from C1 to C2, I mean, another way to say this is your current culture is perfectly aligned to produce the results you're getting right now, by definition. Otherwise, you'd already be getting something else. So in order to move to R2, we have to be very deliberate and conscious about what it means to move from C1 to C2. And in that process, defining the beliefs we need people to hold in our culture is the core spot to focus to enable you to actually leverage all the actions you need people to take. If you can work the belief layer, there's only a handful of beliefs you might need to shift. But those beliefs, when they're entrenched into your culture, they drive a myriad of actions, a ton of actions that you could never define on a sheet of paper in a way that would create alignment and focus throughout your hospital. But if you can get everyone aligned on the right beliefs, you've got an opportunity to create something really, really special in your organization. Tanner, what would you add to that?
You know, I think what I would add is, you know, this all looks logical on paper, and it all makes sense on the left side of our brain. The key in this, of course, is the application. And the application is critical because there are beliefs broadly held today that are undermining and eroding R2. And those beliefs are broadly held, and they run the gamut. It's stay in your lane, we're deeply siloed. It's we are us versus them. We externalize the call light when it goes on. It's not my job. Culture is rooted in the way we do things. Or we're so rooted in a belief that staffing levels aren't right that we cannot deliver on the patient experience. It's absolutely impossible. Well, what we know about beliefs, whether they're accurate or inaccurate, is that they inform actions and eventually produce results. So the application of this question of C1 to C2 leads to a definition around C2. So when you pose the question to an executive team or expanded leadership team of a hospital, what needs to shift around here? They're already aligned on what needs to shift. You might start with a list of 30 things, but there are themes in those 30 things that as you start to thematically distill those down, you come up with a pretty clear picture of what C2 needs to look like. Now, we're showing you now just a sampling of cultural beliefs
from several hospitals, and these are written by the leadership teams of those hospitals.
That's right. Typically, you end up with 5 beliefs. Sometimes you have 6. We're just showing you 7 here as a sampling, but I'll take you through a couple of them. C1 is nurses own the patient experience, and physicians, we need their help too, C1. C2 is create wow, I create extraordinary experiences for everyone every time.
Family, patient, everybody. And if you look at that, just think, for example, if that was a belief that people really held in your hospital. I create wow, everybody, whether I'm environmental services, dietary, clinicians, you name it. I create extraordinary experiences for everyone, every time, and including my peers and my colleagues. If that belief really held true, if people really thought that way, well, what are the actions you would see? You don't have to define 150 competencies because the belief that people actually hold drives all the right actions in that process. Now, there's opportunity for training and there's opportunity for sharing best practices and evidence-based stuff, and all that still holds totally in line there. But instead of just focusing at that layer above that, which there is more stuff than we can shake a stick at, you can drive all of your energy and focus on creating the right set of core beliefs and then let all of that other stuff flow.
So this right here is where most change efforts stall. Most change efforts stop right here. We put everyone together and we define the desired state, and everyone's really excited about it, and then we create a bunch of mouse pads, and ooh, we could do screensavers, and oh, we put posters, even in the elevators, we put posters up. And we we think we've done something, and 4 months later, and we get a lot of phone calls at 4 to 6 months. Hey, we kind of went through and defined the desired state, winning behaviors, winning values, cultural beliefs, whatever they may be, and we sent them out to everyone, and now there's no teeth, there's no traction, it's not showing up. And our answer is that's what you create accountability for is exactly what you end up with. And if you don't operationalize it, if you don't give it teeth, it will live for a few months and it will go the path of every other change management effort. If you get really tactical around how you're going to create new experiences to operationalize the desired state, you end up answering the question, are you really serious about shifting the culture? And that fundamentally is the most important question every executive team has to answer that we work with. When they answer the question, are you serious about this, the culture actually starts to move. I'm on the phone last week with CNO of a very busy 650-bed hospital who's talking about leader routing scores moving from 33% top of the year, 54% mid-year, coming in at 70% last week, or I should say in the month of October. And then overall HCAPs moving from 65th percentile, September 79.4, October 78.2, holding steady. As she's talking about that, she is talking about a cultural shift in the way we think and act bottom to top within our organization around the patient experience. You see impact that's sustainable when you shift people's beliefs.
And you have to, if you're going to really create change. Tanner asked the question, how serious are you about changing your culture? What you could ask is, how serious are you about changing your HCAP scores? Because they're one and the same. Your culture is a reflection of how you satisfy patients. Or I should say your satisfaction scores are a reflection of your culture. At the end of the day, you can't just throw out checklists. You can't just throw out action plans and expect this to sustain. You can create blips. You can create bumps. You can create improvement for a period of time. But to sustain that over a long period of time, it has to be operationalized at an institutional, foundational level. And what we're finding today in the environment of hospitals is we're all looking for that silver bullet because we're under pressure. Our reimbursements are being affected by this, and we've got to get those HCAP scores up. But how serious are you really about doing it? Because we all know the only way to really do something that's going to create lasting change is to invest the right amount of time, resource, and energy to get that to happen. So let's even move this into the next step here. Tanner, do you have anything else you want to add before we move?
No,
how do you do this?
No, I think I just continue with your transition. And so let's back up. Before we speak to how you operationalize this, there are a couple of other kind of guiding fundamental principles that we have to acknowledge. Number one, and this is going to strike you as very simple, but it's rarely applied. I mean, it's almost never, we've never walked into a hospital.
It's amazing how many times we run this.
We have never walked into a hospital where we look at this principle and say it's being applied. So accountability begins by clearly defining the results. And how commonsensical is that? But we virtually never see it.
Well, and the problem with that isn't that you guys don't have measures. You have measures for everything. In fact, you got a gazillion measures. When we say clearly defining results, we're talking about the top 2 or 3 things, the top 4 things. Simplicity. Hospitals, when you look at the environment, hospitals swim in a sea of complexity. Simplicity is always hungered for, but rarely provided. We were working with the CEO of Boston Medical Center, and we asked her, what are your key results? She said, we have balanced scorecard. I said, great. What's on the scorecard? She said, well, let me get it out and read it to you. So she pulled it out and started reading off the scorecard. We got to number 20 as we were writing feverishly to keep up with her. And we said, hold on, how many things are on your scorecard? She said, well, there's 4. And we shook our heads and looked down and said, well, I'm already at 20. Well, what do you mean 4? She goes, well, there's 4 buckets. And we said, oh, so you've got sub-bullets under each bucket. She said, yes. Well, where are we at on the scorecard right now? She said, well, I just finished the first bucket. So we looked at it and said, well, do the other buckets look about the same? She said, yes. I said, so you're asking the organization to focus on 80 things? She said, well, it doesn't sound very good when you say it like that. I said, well, I'm not trying to say it any other way than you're actually describing it, but is that what you're doing?
She was undefensive, but she was acknowledging the reality that we are swimming in a sea of complexity.
Yeah, so she's, that's about what we've got. So we said, well, how well are these understood? She goes, well, they're really well understood. We have dashboards on them, red, yellow, green. You can see where we're at all until a point in time. We've created websites for this. We talk about it in our staff meetings, our town hall meetings. Everybody knows what these are. So we got on the phone with the CFO next, and we asked the CFO the same question. What are the key results? Now, by the way, we talked to a number of their senior executives, and to their credit, every one of them answered this question exactly the same way. They all said, we have a balanced scorecard. And we said, well, great, what's on the scorecard? Every one of them said, let me get it. Let me get it out and read it to you. Find it. And so we said, well, don't read it to me. Just tell us what's on it. How many of those things do you think they could give us with any degree of accuracy? Usually, most people we ask that question to will say 3 to 4. And that's about exactly what it was. Now, here's the next question. Did they all give us the same 3 or 4? Usually we hear no. In fact, where do they go? Which of the 3 or 4 that they actually give us? Tanner, what do they usually give?
Okay, so you'd think it's the first 3 or 4, but it's not what happens. You get the CMOs telling you about clinical outcomes and patient safety and everything related to HCAPs. CFOs talking about reimbursement rates and pulling costs out of the operation, everything we've got to do to land on budget. And by the time we add up everyone's responses, we're at over 60 different responses to the question, what's most important in the coming year? Hospitals are incredibly, terribly bad at creating clarity around what's most important. And
it's because you're being pulled in 80 different directions.
That's right. Because we swim in a sea of complexity in hospitals, simplicity is virtually always hungered for, but it's rarely provided. It's rarely provided. So if we're trying to create a culture of accountability, and we're trying to create accountability for 150 things, we've completely diluted the emphasis. We've diluted accountability, we've diluted resource, we've diluted mind share. So the point here, you guys, is there is tremendous power in simplicity, and yet you almost never see it.
And we do this because we don't want to leave anybody out. We come up with that list of 80 things because we want everyone in every part of the organization to feel important to what we're doing. But it doesn't actually solve that problem. It actually creates more confusion and more disconnect.
So we were yesterday in Sacramento, and Jared and I have what, 350, 400 leaders for the day in the room, and these are HR managers and above for a hospital system in Sacramento. We spent 7 to 8 hours talking about HCAP scores and HR aligning the way they think and act culturally against HCAPs. And when you start to move to a place of total alignment, or top to bottom throughout the organization around HCAPs or around what's most important, you now start functioning as a team, because here's what you typically see. If you look at the difference between these two words and you say, okay, how would you define activity? We say, okay, it's actions that people take that lead to results. If you then say, okay, so what's a result? We define a result. A result is the desired and undesired outcome of people taking actions. You then pose the question, okay, so which of these two things is a CNO, or let's say, say a CNO for a moment, which of these two things is a CNO accountable for at the end of the year, activity or results? And we all know it's results. How easy is it for a CNO to go back to the CEO and say, okay, we haven't delivered on HCAPs, but have you seen all of the activity going on, right? That's never going to fly. But as you progress down the org chart from the CNO and you progress outward from the CNO, and you look at what people tend to be accountable for, you tend to see a very narrow definition of what I'm accountable for. I'm accountable to deliver the food.
My job.
My job.
My job.
You have someone in labs, and they can tell you their job description, and they tend to frame it around activity. So we apply the wrong filter first. We say, welcome to the system. We're thrilled to have you here. Here's a job description. Oh, by the way, it contains a list of activities. And, oh, we hope you know you impact HCAP scores. Very quickly, new employee loses line of sight to what's most important, and they become only concerned about the transactional requirements of doing the job.
I mean, you guys have heard the environmental services person who's in the room, they're asked, what's your job? And his job is, well, my job, his response is, my job is to save lives. Well, you're cleaning rooms. You're not a clinician. How do you save lives? Well, if I clean the room right, I kill all the germs in the room. If I kill all the germs in the room, the next person can't be infected by that. That's how I impact patient quality, safety, and lives. So if you actually reverse this thinking, instead of trying to list all the things that everyone has to do to feel like they're connected, just look at your hospital for a moment and ask, what are the top 2 or 3 things that we have to deliver on to be successful by the end of the next year or the end of 2 years or whatever that is? Well, if those 3 things are something that looks like this on your screen right now, then why don't we just say that to everybody? Guys, this is what we have to do in our hospital in the next year to 2 years, and then flip it. Now ask everyone else to tell you how they can help you get there.
And that's applying the right filter first. And it almost never happens. And when you get this simple, and you can pull aside a charge nurses, we do often, and we ask the question, give us the top three things that are most important, and you hear uniformity and consistency in response to that question, that's a powerful environment. It's not necessarily a patient-centric culture yet, but this is a starting place. So when we back off of this model, the results pyramid, we say, okay, there's one other thing you've got to understand. We feel really strongly about this because it's so easy to be complicated. It's so difficult to be simple. And the natural state of affairs will lean towards complexity if we're not disciplined and focused on creating simplicity. So another way to look at this is to look at the limitations of people just doing the quote-unquote job. So let's put top left box, that's our nurses, that's our clinicians.
Activity versus result.
That's right, that's right. So our clinician, or our nurses, you're the top left box. You know what you're responsible for, signified by the R. Physicians, you're the upper right box. You know what you're responsible for. You've got your box of responsibilities. And EVS, other support staff will put in the bottom box, you know what you're responsible for.
We didn't even like that word support staff, right, because they're all driving it.
That's right. So you've got labs, you've got anyone else that's touching the patient. So responsibility, we know what we're responsible for. As soon as something comes up that's outside of my box, in an environment where people know what their activity is, what they're accountable for from an activity standpoint, do things ever fall through the cracks? Do call lights ever get turned on?
Never.
That don't get responded to? It happens all of the time. Why? It's because we are allowing things to fall through the cracks because we framed accountability too narrowly. So how do we solve that problem? What does the organization demand more of? When we're not delivering on HCAPs, we're short-staffed. We go to staffing first. So we hire more people. Scores don't move. And we continue to see things fall through the cracks. So what's the problem?
More people.
Staffing. So we hire more people, pretty soon we look like this. And we're no more accountable. We just have more opportunity for things to fall through the cracks, more opportunity to blame and externalize.
Because the fundamental shift here is not just adding more, it's how are we thinking about it.
That's right. So in this environment, behaviorally, you see people act differently. You see, we got an email a couple of weeks ago from the CEO of a hospital on the East Coast who had recently learned of someone from EVS in his hospital.
It's a great story.
Who had been in a patient room. He heard the spouse of a patient expressing concern that the patient had not been eating that day. This gentleman's name is DeMarcus. He comes back into the room later in the day and he notices the patient still has not eaten and the spouse has gone home. DeMarcus asks the patient, can I help feed you? And the patient says, I would love that.
Puts his mop down.
Puts his mop down, washes his hands, and he sits down and he feeds the patient. He goes home that night off hours. He's changed. He's becoming concerned several hours later, again, is the patient eating. And he comes back off the clock and he feeds the patient again. This happens for 3 days in a row without anyone knowing what DeMarcus is doing off the clock.
Going to the patient's room at the right times to help him eat.
The CEO, others become aware of what's happening, and they recognize this patient for living Be the Difference, one of their cultural beliefs, and they make a major deal out of what DeMarcus has just done. That story right there is what we would refer to as a type 1 experience. It lives on. They posted that in their community, and in 48 hours they had 65,000 hits on or 65,000 likes on their Facebook page. That's the type of behavior you see when you get accountability for the patient experience right. When HCAP connection happens top to bottom, we actually start functioning as a team, irrespective of function. I mean, typically we say we hope clinicians get their arms around 75th percentile. Let's hope they figure that out. And let's cheer for them along the way.
But the key there is that organization had focused on creating a shift, which they defined as Be the Difference, that I am the difference in the patient experience. Every employee, look for ways. We don't want we don't want an EVS guy cracking someone's ribs open and doing heart surgery, obviously, right? But there are ways that you can be the difference for patients. So find them, look for them. That's a belief. When you've got that belief in place, all the actions, you could never tell DeMarcus to go look for that situation and do it. But because we worked the belief layer appropriately and got him to take accountability for that belief, you see a difference.
Yeah, no policy is going to get you to that end.
That's right.
Right. So essentially in the overlapping sections here are HCAP scores we're not delivering today, but actually would if every single employee felt connected and accountable for their delivery. So second core model that we'll introduce to you here, and the final core model we'll speak to, is a model we call the steps to accountability. Everything we've just described to you will fail if this model is not understood and applied. The model describes personal accountability. That's simply stated, that's what it defines.
Yeah, if you think about what above the line looks like versus below the line you're frustrated, you're stressed out. You're focused typically on all the things you cannot control. You're coming up with a good story to explain and justify why we're not achieving the results. You know, the N is too small. That's why we don't get our patient scores.
The data's off.
The data's off. It's not the right people. Or you can go around and around and around. We've all heard them. And it's not that those things are wrong, by the way. Those things may be absolutely true. Some of you are shaking your head saying, oh, yeah, that's true. That's not the issue here. The issue is, do we tend to get stuck focusing on those things, or do we get what we refer to as above the line and see it, own it, solve it, do it? We see the reality. We acknowledge the reality. The N might be too small. Or we acknowledge that there's staffing issues. There might be real staffing issues that you're struggling with that are impacting this. It's not a question of, is that the problem? The question is, where do we focus and what do we do with what we see? Do we then own, solve, and do?
So another really important point is this line represents engagement. And when people are below the line, there are varying degrees of disengagement that you see. And when people are above the line, they're totally engaged in getting the end outcome. A below the line externalization, tell a story as to why it's so difficult and why I can't deliver, blame, externalize, smoke and mirrors, buy myself more time. And that's behaviorally what you see when a culture has drifted below the line. Based on repeated experience, people believe that it's actually acceptable to blame any litany of reasons for why we're not delivering, and spending a lot of time and mind share and energy in the hallway around those realities. Above the line, all of the mind share and focus is on what else can I do. Below the line, how else do I explain and justify why it's just not possible to get it done. And so the great value of this model is it creates awareness around where am I spending my time as an individual. Because if I'm spending a lot of time below the line, if I get the results, it's just total luck. It's total coincidence and happenstance. Versus if I'm operating above the line, I actually feel like I'm in control. I'm in the driver's seat. We feel that way collectively when you get the culture operating above the line. It's a powerful, powerful environment when that happens.
DeMarcus could have easily gone below the line. He could have looked at that patient, looked at the food, and said, somebody really should get on that. Somebody should really feed that guy. But he actually saw the situation and said, you know what, this is something I can do. And then he solved it and he did it. And he took accountability for something he saw. When you look in your environment and you see something, you now have a choice to make on whether you take accountability for that or you go below the line and wait for somebody else to do it.
So a theoretical question we'll pose to you is, how much time and energy in your hospital today is being devoted to below the line conversations, externalizing, blaming? How many meetings are spending tremendous energy externalizing why we can't perform? It sucks the life out of engagement. It sucks the life out of empowerment. Everyone becomes a victim of circumstance. Our demographics of our hospital are so counter to us being able to deliver. We've got shared rooms, therefore the patient will never respond on HCAPs, and we can come up with a litany of reasons. Our clients will tell you that they're only successful with culture change when they start creating awareness around personal accountability. And when that happens, the leading indicator of culture movement is your engagement scores. Lagging indicator are HCAPs and all of your other important clinical outcomes and so forth. But you know you're starting to move the needle when you're moving engagement scores. And this is, what we've just introduced to you here is an engagement model. That's what it is. It defines lack of engagement versus fully engaged. And you guys we'll invite you as well to not be fooled by the simplicity of any model we're introducing here. Because it's simple, it sticks. And again, there's great power in simplicity. So as soon as we introduce this language to our clients and and we roll it out, and we have the
lazy you on this call. This language is gonna stick for you, above line, below line.
That's right, and people years down the road use it because it's such a simple, intuitive framework.
So guys, we want to summarize our call today and then turn over some time for question and answer here in a moment. But this is everything we've talked about so far today, and actually a little bit more. At the center of this there are two key results that you need. What do you need your HCAP scores to be? You've got to have a compelling case for why you need to move. You need the two core models, above the line and the results pyramid. On the bottom left, you see the 4 culture management tools that we start with. It's focused feedback, focused storytelling, focused recognition, and focused accountability. Those are the things you tactically drive to shift culture and move people toward a patient experience environment.
And those tools start showing up in meetings. Every meeting has culture management happening. And that's right, with strategy. So the meeting becomes balanced. We again talk about moving from strategy being the world to everyone to understanding that culture is going to be a key, if not the most important driver. And now the meetings start being experiential, and they start working on beliefs, and they become culture experiences as opposed to tactical conversations around how do we move the needle, death by PowerPoint, et cetera.
And when you do that, when it shows up in meetings, you create this graphic that you're seeing here, where you create a critical mass for change, and it accelerates and grabs momentum. And the way you continue that momentum is to follow what we call a simple change management model, which is train, retain, sustain. Training is quick, it's getting it done, getting it fast, and then moving into retain and sustain, which is where most of the effort is.
As we move to opening to questions here in a moment, you can start sending your questions in to Jesse, and that will be an opportunity for us to respond. As Jesse mentioned earlier, we'll stay on as long as we need to answer any of your questions that you have. I don't want to shortchange what Jared's just introduced here on TRS, or train, retain, sustain. Most change efforts stop after training. We fool ourselves into thinking training is going to shift culture, when in fact training freezes belief bias for a period of time, and it reorients it in the right direction. There has to be retention 7 times, 7 different ways before it sticks over the course of months and years. We're not going to walk you through every aspect of the process map, but sustainability, systems integration, when you start getting culture integrated into the way you hire, the way you promote people, your human performance system, the way you performance review your people, the way you recognize people, the way you tell stories, culture, you get your people bumping into culture everywhere they look. And now I'm actually convinced that we're serious about C2, and that doesn't happen in a one-day training.
And we're highlighting HCAPs on that, but it's much more than HCAPs.
It is. It's bigger than that.
And so, yeah.
That's right. But there are multiple steps to the process to ensure that modeling is happening at the top. You're seeing integration meetings multiple times here with the executive team. If those meetings don't happen, we're typically, Jared might hammer me for saying this, but we're typically not interested in working the project because we know where those projects go. We're interested in transformation and what we call big T.
We had a chief legal officer of a major hospital system recently say, I've got 2 advanced degrees. I've run my own private practice in the legal field. And as I've been brought into the hospital environment about 10 years ago, I've realized I've never had any formal training or development on how to be a leader and make culture work. And we find that to be true across most of you, that you don't work culture, not because you don't know it. I mean, the first poll we asked, 80% of you, 90% of you said culture has the most impact on our HCAP scores. So why don't you work it?
Well, we don't know how.
Because we don't know how.
No one's ever taught us how do you actually define the desired state, and then how do you manage to it?
And move that needle.
So we discount it. We put it in the gray bucket. It's soft. It's warm and fuzzy. We don't want to deal with it because we're not totally comfortable with how to do that. So we would round this out by saying either you manage your culture, or, and you know where this is going, it will manage you. It will evolve to become whatever it becomes on its own. Finally, there are 2 ways to promote change. One is to try little t, and one is to go big T. Little t is almost always what you see, and we do training, and then we never really put any teeth to it, and we then do the new program in 6 months from now. And after 4 years, we've done 4 different programs. We've built no depth of proficiency around any one thing, and it goes away. That's little t. Big T requires different thinking. It requires a mindset around integration into current systems before it really is going to make a difference. And so the key,
big T, Big T is getting everyone to touch the patient differently than they're currently doing it today, and that's not just a training.
And to have culture defined that promotes that behavior. Unless you have that and you put a spotlight on it, so a guiding principle of change management is you water what you want to see grow. If you want to see something grow, you put a spotlight on it. Today, C1 is growing and flourishing. So you've got to put a spotlight on C2 and water the heck out of it. And if you do, it actually starts to grow if people become convinced that we're not letting go and we're sticking with it. So you guys, we're going to turn the time over to Q&A. We haven't let a lot of time for that, but we want to, Jesse, we'll defer back to you to kind of facilitate the Q&A, and we'll be happy to respond to any questions that are coming in.
Great, thanks Tanner and thanks Jared. We do have some questions that have come in so far, so I'll go ahead and get started. The first question today comes from Erica. She said, "It seems so easy, but as a staff nurse, I am on the Nursing Quality Committee. How can I introduce this to the C-suite? I guess I could start by forwarding the recording of this webinar to my nurse manager and CNO."
Great question. Jesse, give me the name again of who asked the question.
That question came from Erica.
Erica. So Erica, great question. Our response would be yes, sending a link to the webinar recording, which everyone on this call will receive. We also have a 8 to 10 page PDF that we call the Hospital Change Methodology. That's a white paper that outlines some of the key principles. We went a little deeper here than the white paper goes, but you'll see the framework introduced in that white paper, and we'd be happy to send that out to you and anyone else who wants. It is deep enough. It's executive. It's written for C-suite so that they can read it and digest it.
And Erica, we're happy to put other CEOs or other senior leaders of other hospitals on the phone with your executive team. We like to do that level to level. We don't want to ask a CEO to get on the phone with someone that, you know, we want to put them on with another CEO.
Yeah.
But if you've got at least their attention enough to talk to somebody, we will facilitate that and make those kind of calls happen as well. We're happy to do that.
Absolutely. What else, Jesse?
Great, thanks. Our next question comes from Mark. He said, "Earlier you said you have helped several hospitals achieve great results. Are they all doing the same thing, or are they all different?"
Yeah, that's a great question. And when it comes to culture, culture is not always the same. Every culture is a little unique and a little different, and you've got different things happening. You've got a different history. Those have all led to different experiences and beliefs. You've got different pressures. So the models are the same. The steps to accountability, the results pyramid, that doesn't change. But the application of those models, the beliefs that you select that need to shift in your organization, the application of the tools, the way you engage your staff, and the model you use to engage your staff, those are all up for grabs. They're all designed to meet the specific needs of your own organization.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Richard asking, "Can you share example hospitals that have applied this methodology and seen their scores grow along with their success stories?"
Yeah, we could speak to several. One that we've seen happen actually this year recently, OSF Home Care started 14 months ago in the 13th percentile. They've moved up to the 75th percentile in 14 months on satisfaction scores.
Dramatic. And we've actually written an article and a paper on that one that's been published. That one's available for reading if you'd like to read that specifically.
And there are, in this question, I'm going to relate back to the last question, there are common themes in all of it. AJ, the CEO of their organization, would tell you, as he's told many of our clients, that his modeling at the top is critical. It's fundamental. Culture reflects leadership. And so we don't let this become an HR effort. As much as we need HR's leadership here and support, it cannot be viewed that way. It's the experiences are the loudest at the top, and especially at the very, very top of the org chart. So there's a lot of coaching involved in that. There's a lot of reinforcement and skill building and measuring to ensuring follow through and integration and so forth. But that would be a common thread with every success story that we can tell. So that's kind of a dramatic one, right? 13th percent up to 75th percent, but that's not always the shift that's needed. Sometimes we know that it's $1 million, I should say millions of dollars to get into top tier on reimbursement rates, and that's a big deal. Sometimes that's a matter of 1 or 2 percentage points to put us in that next level, and that's the shift in that case. And so the fundamentals are the same, but the need is different depending upon what R2 is.
So OSF, we're working with Inova out in D.C. We're working with some other organizations that we have to be somewhat careful on who we talk about and how we talk about them, but we're happy to be more specific as we talk to you directly.
I should mention the Boston Medical story we told you we were there, that was 10 years ago, that exchange with that CEO, and we've written about that story, and so there is we do need to of course protect confidentiality on those that we are actively engaged with if we have agreements that limit us in that regard.
Other questions?
Thank you both. Our next question comes from Keith asking, how do you handle about 80% buy-in slash participation in this process, but the other 20% torpedo the results?
So there's we don't have it built into this deck, but there is a culture change curve that we talk about. And the curve is initially when you introduce the change idea, you get 30% who are champions. You get another 30 to 40% that are kind of sitting back with their arms folded saying, I'm going to wait and see what happens here. And I'm not making a dig at physicians, but the physicians tend to land in that group. The preponderance of them land in that group initially as this change effort begins. They think it's fluff. They don't know that it's real, and they need to be convinced otherwise. Then you have a bottom percentage, let's say it's 10 to 20% at the bottom, that have digged in their heels. They become so jaded over time that they're not going to engage. They're not going to enroll. That group can also include rock star clinicians, very well thought of physicians, but they're a cancer to the culture. They're below the line so chronically, and it spreads like a cancer that we don't know what to do with them. So here's what we'd say. As this train starts to leave the station, we start moving towards C2, those that are below the line and those that are continuing to reinforce C1 thinking start to stick out. And many of them self-select out, and others are moved out because we've got to create an experience that we can't allow C1 and below the line to continue to permeate.
And the question becomes again, how serious are you about changing your culture?
That's the fundamental question.
Are you willing to address those issues and move those people to a different spot, coach them, guide them to a different spot, or move them out? And at the right moment, you need to have those discussions and conversations, and you need that 80% or 70% to support and pick up that ball and continue to move those experiences in the right direction and not allow that small group to derail it.
Great question. Jesse.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Our next question comes from Richard asking, what have been some barriers to success?
So we can tell you crash and burn stories, and we have them. And the crash and burn stories also have very common themes. I'll speak to one or two, and Jared, add any that you'd like. One common theme is we work with leaders that are thinking little t and not realizing they've got to be thinking big T. They think it's about training when it's really about retaining and sustaining.
They put all their efforts in the training bucket and no effort in the retain.
Like 99.9% about training.
When it should be reversed.
Because that their belief throughout their careers, that's how you affect change. They've been taught that that's how you do it when it's really not how you do it. It's how you introduce awareness, but that's it. So number one is we think little t, we've got to be thinking big T. Number two is along the way we don't manage the contradictions well. Sometimes CEOs will create massive C1 contradictions. We've said C2, but yet they're not simplifying in focus. We've said that that's a significant shift for us to deliver on our key results on R2.
Not just CEOs,
that's right.
Any other leaders.
It could be any leaders.
Directors.
But the higher up in the org chart, the louder the contradiction, the louder the ripple throughout the organization, the greater the impact. And so if we're not surgical in addressing the contradictions along the way, then those contradictions can be loud enough to undermine the credibility of the change effort.
And part of that is enabling the entire organization with these models and language to be able to bring it up and address
in a safe way.
That felt C1. That didn't feel like where we're trying to go. And having leaders be humble enough and willing enough to say, you know what, you're right, that was C1.
And the power of developing the beliefs with the expanded leadership team, so we take the first three layers of the organization through what we call the Develop the Beliefs experience, and we align collectively as a leadership team. This isn't the CEO going to the cabin and deciding C2. This is a collaborative effort to align around what C2 needs to look like. And once you've got definition of C2 in place, we now have permission to use the tools and offer feedback around where we're not seeing it. And CEOs eventually develop a skill and proficiency and humility around understanding where they're not seeing C2. And there's process behind that. There's assessments that are used and so forth to create that clarity.
And it's also why this process map is important. You'll notice on this map several integration meetings. These integration meetings need to occur at different times throughout the process, right? These integration meetings are occurring to help create and drive that ongoing shift, because you've got a lot of muscle memory in how you do things the way you do them today. You lead and act a certain way because you've been doing it that way for a long time. You can't just do one training and expect all that to change. You got to let people digest the change, then try it, then bump into the wall, then come back, digest the next
What's not working, what's not sticking,
right.
Why isn't it working?
So the next question might be, well, how long does this take? Well, the reality is you'll create a bump pretty quick. Within 4 to 5 months, you'll start to see some things really happening differently. But over the next year, like a 12 to 18-month window of the whole project starting to where you start to really see things moving, you're going to see the sustain and the retain and sustain elements drive your scores up to a place where they start sustaining.
And then the middle 40% with their arms folded saying, are we serious about this, eventually have the question answered, because it's continuing, the tools are continuing to show up in meetings. There's reteaching happening in meetings that are already on the calendar. We're coming back to it in different ways. Visuals are going up on the walls, and there's at the right time, and there's a consistent yet comprehensive message around, or a better way of saying it, we are comprehensively answering the question, are you serious about it? Because evidence is everywhere.
Great question.
Great question. Jesse.
Great, thank you. As we prepare to wrap up today, we do have 2 additional questions, the first of which has come from Susan, saying, we've had the same culture for 50 years, something some in our organization are very proud of. How do you create change when not everyone wants it?
Yeah, so that's another great question. And most people, when they hear culture change, they interpret that as we're throwing out all the old and starting over. That's not actually the right way to think about it. It's actually almost more accurate to refer to it as cultural evolution. We're evolving our culture to a place where it needs to be to enable us to get the result we need to get today. It's not about the past has got us where we're at today. That's fine. Some of that should be applauded, and it's great. We've been very successful. But that's not the question. The question now is to get to R2, the results we need to get in the future. Are we set up to do that today, or are there some adjustments that need to be made in our culture to produce that result? That's where we become very formulaic from C1 to C2 to R1 to R2, and it answers the question that it's not about is the culture good or bad, it's is the culture prepared to deliver R2.
Great, thank you. Our last question today comes from Jennifer. She had said, a belief has been formed in our organization that we are short-staffed, and while we know this is a common belief, we have also grown by 20% in the last 12 months and not been able to change this belief and move forward. What would you suggest we do?
So, Jennifer, beautiful, 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 perfect example of belief bias. We work with administrators all the time who say, boy, we've heard people clamoring for a fix with staffing, and we've done this, we've done that, we've done this, we've done that, and we've done all of these things at the action layer to fix it, and yet the perception still is that staffing's a problem. Why? Well, the reason that's happening is because belief bias culturally is oriented towards we can't deliver because of staffing. And if this is how belief bias works, let's say I've got a belief about Jared, that Jared's lazy, he's disengaged, he comes to every meeting late, and he's not very engaged. And Jared sees the error of his ways, and he says, I'm going to change. And he shows up on time to work 90 days in a row. Day 91 comes along, and Jared's late. What do we all think? Oh, see, there's Jared, he's always late. We will ignore 90 days worth of evidence that suggests that Jared is changing and improving because belief bias, we're unaware that belief bias is working. So if the belief is anchored in C1 that staffing's an issue and we're actually doing some things to address it, we can actually, the organization can miss all of that and still hold the belief that we're not aggressively addressing staffing.
And just maybe a provocative question, and I know this isn't 100% accurate, but I'm going to throw it out there. You do have to ask the question, is some of our staffing issues based on the fact that we're asking so many action layer tasks of people that aren't actually getting the result we need? Are we willing to walk away from things that aren't working at the action layer to get to a better outcome? That, you know, that's a question we should be asking ourselves on a regular basis. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Jesse.
All right, great. Thank you both. And thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar today. Tanner and Jared are eager to speak with you about what they can do for your hospital and how to improve your HCAP scores. Again, we'd like to thank you for joining us today. This concludes today's presentation.